Thank you, Lewis and Dr. DiPietro and Jimmy Cheek and ladies and gentlemen. What Lewis, as you can imagine, I was really lucky to have a chance to work with Lewis Levine when I was getting started, and Tom Ingram too. I mean, I was just really privileged to do that, and we had a real good time. I mean, our motto was, let's figure out the right thing to do and do it, and that will confuse the opposition. You'd be surprised how true that is. And as far as tone goes, I'll leave it where Lewis left it, except to say that right after I was elected governor, there was a lot going on back through then. Some of you may remember how I came into office a little early, and my predecessor was excused from office, and we had a pretty rough campaign versus Jake Butcher. I mean, anybody who thinks Tennessee politics is Sunday school picnic doesn't know much about Tennessee politics. But so I was in my first couple of weeks, and one of the new cabinet members came in to see me, who will go unnamed. He wanted to see me one-on-one. I said, okay. He said, I just have one question. He said, you know all that stuff you said in the campaign about how we're supposed to do the right thing and do business? I said, yes. He said, did you mean it? I said, yes. He said, okay, I was just checking. Because obviously, he had somebody already was testing him about the way to do business. You have a present, which I hope you won't read now. This is collections. I gave so many, it's 311 rules and lessons. People do this after they've been around a while. They write all this so-called wisdom down. Jack Brown of Nashville helped me with it. Jack's son came to the University of Tennessee many years ago, and he wrote a book called A Father's Book of Wisdom. You know, what a dad would say to a boy who's about to, go to college. You can imagine how much the son wants to hear that. So it sold about 500 copies. And Jack, about a year later, Jack changed it to Life's Little Instruction Book and sold 5 million copies. I got him to help me with the format of this. It has such useful things. If you're a politician, rule number 73, walk in parades. Rule number 74, if it is the Mule Day Parade, walk at the front. I was asked to discuss understanding East Tennessee and how it fits into the state. And I'll take a few minutes doing that. And it was said that conversation afterwards, is that right, Lewis? Questions or comments, and then we'll get out at a reasonable time. I was trying to think of how to do that. And I think it helps if you're going to hear from somebody to know where they're coming from. So here's where I'm coming from on the subject of East Tennessee. Tennessee's changed a lot. In fact, there are probably more people like Phil Bredesen and Carl, who were born somewhere else, but who are such good Tennesseans, they're the mayor of Nashville or the governor of Tennessee. That's probably the majority, because this has become a very attractive state for people moving in. So we're all Tennesseans. But that's not our family. In October of last year, we baptized our youngest grandson, whose name is Houston Lamar Alexander. Fortunately, they're calling him Houston for him. We baptized him in Hesse Creek in West Miller's Cove. A friend of ours is an Episcopal priest in Nashville, and she came up. She had a white flowing robe on. We were in a little chapel there and had this hillbilly band, and they sang a few hymns, and then we walked down to the creek, and they were singing that song from "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Going down to the river to pray, if you've listened to that. And then she took this poor little 1-year-old boy and pinched his nose and put him right in the cold water in October. The reason I tell you that is he's a 9th-generation Tennessean. That's about as far back as you can go unless you're a Native American. So I'm 7th, I guess. I've got 6 generations ahead of me who are buried within about 15 miles of here. And so, for whatever it's worth, I've got that perspective on Tennessee. I also studied Tennessee by walking across the state, spending the night with people. That was the most fascinating thing I guess I ever did. Lewis actually planned it all, and we have a map on the route. And if you really want to know Tennessee, I'd recommend that. I mean, you spend the night with people, and if you have supper with them and they have in their friends after supper to talk, and you sleep in their beds, by the time you've done that for 6 months, you know a whole lot about this state that you didn't know when you started. So that's where I'm coming from. Alex Haley, a great Tennessean who grew up in the West, lived here too, once was at Norris when I was making a speech, and he came up afterwards and said, Lamar, he said, may I make a suggestion? I said, well, sure, Alex. He said, if when you're making a speech, you would say, instead of making a speech, let me tell you a story, people might actually listen to what you have to say. That was just a revelation to me, and I've tried to follow it ever since. So to start, I'm going to just tell you a few stories. And to start understanding East Tennessee, you have to start with the mountains. They asked me what piece I would leave with you, and it's in your materials. It's what I said at the 75th anniversary of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park not long ago. The mountains are special, but the way the park was created is even more special. David Rockefeller was here a few months ago. He's 95. He was here to look for beetles because there are more kinds of species in the Great Smoky National Park than in all of Europe, and he's got the best beetle collection in the world, all of which he's going to give to Harvard University. So he was down here looking for beetles. His father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., in the mid-30s, was persuaded to give $5 million for the creation of this national park. Now, this park is different because it's the only major park given to the United States. All the rest are carved out of land the government already owned. Now, imagine the Depression era. And the idea was to create a park in the east. Knoxville had a major role in that. City Council did. And Governor Austin Peay did, Kim. I've said to my Clarksville friends that I suspect Governor Peay, 6 years or so as governor, I think he's probably our best governor. But here he is, the 30s. He's from Clarksville. The state's one party, Democratic. Everything's in Nashville. And he brings the legislature up here twice by train to see the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, so they'll appropriate $2 million to help build it. North Carolina does the same. And then children gave pennies for another $1 million, and that was $5 million. And John D. Rockefeller gave the other $5 million, and they bought, with that $10 million, the 500,000 acres that are the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, that's visited every year by 3 times as many people as go to Yellowstone. It's one of the 10 most visited places in the world. So we have Elvis's house at one end of the state, the most visited house, and we have the Great Smokies here. But it's a remarkable place. And David Rockefeller told Dwight McCarter, who I think you're going to meet. He's my friend who's, I think I saw him on your program in a day. He's a backcountry ranger retired from the park. His job has been for 30 years to go find people who were lost. And he wrote a little book called Lost. Half of them were alive and half of them were dead. And he'll tell you wonderful stories, and most of them are true. But he told me that David Rockefeller told him that his father didn't think Tennessee and North Carolina would be able to raise the money. But he agreed to give the $5 million anyway. So that's where the park came. So you have a very special feeling of ownership of these mountains. I think there are a lot of Tennesseans who on their tombstones would probably put, if they knew about it, which many do, Emily Dickinson's words, goodbye to the life I used to live and the friends I used to know. Now kiss these hills just once for me, for I am ready to go. I mean, there's a lot of feeling about it. And when I was governor, I was invited by John Cook, who was then the superintendent of the park, to play the piano with the Knoxville Symphony in Cades Cove. And then a couple or 3 years ago on the 75th anniversary of the park, I was invited to do it again while I was senator. I don't think I'll be invited to the 100th anniversary of the park. But it's a remarkable thing to be there with the symphony on a beautiful afternoon and hear Amazing Grace and hear the fiddles imitating the bagpipes of the first Scotch-Irish people who came here. So that's where you start in understanding East Tennessee. Now, that's who it attracted, were the Scotch-Irish people mainly. They were wild and ornery and really pretty no count. People would put them, the governors would put them at the edge of the civilization because they were willing to fight anybody. And second, they didn't want to live with them. And the Germans came in after that, kind of clean up after the Scotch-Irish. People came to the United States, based on topography that was like where they came from. The Scandinavians all liked going up to Minnesota and Finland. It was like Finland or something like that. But the Scots, they liked it here because these mountains and hills were like Scotland. And they would go from here to northwest Arkansas or southwest Missouri, where it's a lot the same. Senator Blunt and Senator Bozeman and I have something we call the Hillbilly Caucus because we're all three from this kind of Scotch-Irish culture. These people are who are of this ilk, like mine, are, as they say at the Rankin reunion, that's my mother's family, they're hard to turn. That means they're ornery, would be one way to say it. They're culturally conservative. They're cautious. They prefer the creek to the horizon. I'm married to a Texan. Honey's from Texas. So when we built log cabins up in West Miller's Cove, she wanted one up on the hill, and I wanted one down by the creek. That's just Texans are sort of Tennesseans with taller tails and broader horizons, and the environment shapes the personality of people. The East Tennesseans historically have been very independent, and since the Civil War, very Republican. In this congressional district has never elected a Democrat to Congress since Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. In Blount County, where I live, I don't think there's any Democrat elected. There may be one or two county commissioners, but you go year after year with no Democrats elected. Now, in West and Middle Tennessee, there's been a change since the Civil War. Many of the African Americans have gone from being Lincoln Republicans to Roosevelt and Kennedy Democrats. Many of the white Tennesseans have gone to the Republican side, but in East Tennessee, you can almost go by precinct and by county and find Confederates. I mean, you go to Sullivan County, up where Kingsport is, it'll send a Democrat to the legislature because there's a history of Confederates and Democrats. When I walked across the state, I stayed up on Rome Mountain with a man named John I. Morgan, who was old, and he still called Democrats rebels because of the history of the Civil War. There's language that you have to understand if you can. That has a lot, language always tells you a lot about culture, and East Tennessee has its own particular language. The way you can tell whether somebody is actually a bona fide East Tennessean is whether they can say the following words. It's a right bright night for a nice knife fight. If you can say that, you're probably from East Tennessee. If you pretend to say it, you can't ever learn it unless you grew up talking that way. And a lot of East Tennesseans were poor. In fact, a lot of the state is poorer than most states. Probably the single most important thing I was reminded of walking across the state in 1978 was that people had less money than I really understood. I mean, I came from a family of teachers in Maryville, so we didn't have money growing up. But Tennessee was the third poorest state in 1978. East Tennessee was so poor in the early days that many houses had GTT carved into the door, gone to Texas. And that's how a lot of Texans can say it's a right bright night for a nice knife fight. They have a distinctive way of talking as well. Love of the outdoors goes to do with the mountains. And if you grow up here, you grow up in Boy Scouts and you're in the mountains every weekend or every other weekend. And you love the mountains. It's not a liberal thing or a conservative thing or a political thing. It's just part of it. It's not always hunting and fishing. It's just an appreciation of the outdoors. I usually vote for about every clean air opportunity that comes up in the United States Senate, and I get hit over the head sometimes by people who said, why do you do that? I said, well, why wouldn't I do that? I mean, on one hand, I understand the importance of it to metropolitan areas. I remember when Nissan was coming to Nashville, the first thing they did was go to the State Water Quality Board and see if they could get a permit, an air permit for their paint plant. Paint plants emit a lot of stuff. And if the air around Nashville had been too dirty, Nissan would have been in Georgia, and our auto story would be very different. If Chattanooga hadn't cleaned itself up after the 1960s when it was said on CBS it's the dirtiest city in America, the Volkswagen plant would be a parking lot today. That's what Chattanoogaans say about themselves. And Knoxville is just beginning to move back toward cleaner air. But people around here want that. They may be Republicans, but that's what they want. I go into the Sevier County Chamber of Commerce. They're even more Republican than Blount County, where I live. And I ask them their number one priority. They say clean air. People don't drive down here to see the smog. They want to see the Smokies. And so a love of the outdoors. And then music. Knoxville, by all rights, should have been Music City. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you think about it, you have Tennessee Ernie, and then you had the Knoxville radio stations, WNOX and others, and you had the people who composed the music and sang the music. I mean, Chet Atkins and Roy Acuff were from Union County. Dolly Parton's from Sevier County. The Everly Brothers graduated from high school here in West High School in Knoxville. And they all performed on something called the Kaz Walker Show, which was a morning show with this crusty old councilman who had singers on so he could sell groceries, and he delivered a lot of politics with his stuff too. Dolly was on there, the Everlys were on there, Chet was on there, Archie Campbell was on there, all these people. And then they'd say, well, where are you going to be next week, as you would to pickers and singers? Well, I'm going to be in Alcoa and Oak Ridge and Sevierville, just right around Knoxville, because that was as far as the radio station carried. In the 1920s, long before the people I just mentioned, National Life and Accident Insurance Company wanted to sell debit insurance. They were headquartered in Nashville. And they had a lot of political influence, and so they were able to get a 100,000-watt radio station called WSM. Nashville got two of them, WLAC as well. At that time, the politics, as I said, was all one party centered in Middle Tennessee, so they got the radio stations and Knoxville didn't. So what happened? Well, they started the Grand Ole Opry to get people to advertise their debit insurance. They hired Roy Acuff to be on the Grand Ole Opry so people would listen to the Grand Ole Opry. So Roy moves from Knoxville down to Nashville. And then as the other pickers and singers come along, they don't want to say, well, I'll be in Sevierville and Alcoa and Oak Ridge. They want to be interviewed on WSM and say, where are you going to be next week? I'm going to be in Birmingham and New Orleans and Kansas City. And you could hear them all around there. So that's what drew music to Nashville. The music in Tennessee is from East Tennessee and Memphis. But Nashville's radio stations are what brought it there. So it's really, and the last couple of things, it's the oldest part of the state. East Tennessee, though, is not much older than parts of Middle Tennessee. I've got a map that I bought from Ben Caldwell, which some of you in Nashville know. It's of the United States in 1783. That's the year, the end of the Revolutionary War. And there are probably a few thousand Europeans in the Tennessee territory at that time. There are only two cities that are now Tennessee cities that are on the map. One is Knoxville, one is Clarksville. Those are the only two cities that were on the map in 1783. There are two other things. One is federal money. Here you have this rock rib Republican anti-federal government area, and more federal money pours in here than almost anywhere in the state of Tennessee. Into Oak Ridge, and Tom Mason's in your group. Oak Ridge gets about $3 billion a year in federal dollars. About $1 billion to the, I guess it's about $1 billion to the lab, about $2 billion to the defense activities over there. You've got TVA, unique. It's a $10 or $11 billion a year company. You've got the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. All these created about the same time. And you've got the University of Tennessee, which has lots of federal money with students and research. Which brings me to the last thing you have to know if you want to know about East Tennessee, and that's this place. I mean, the University of Tennessee and the Big Orange Nation, it dominates everything here. I mean, last night I was at the UT Texas A&M basketball game. UT should have won. There are 18,000 people there to attest to that. But at the last minute, Texas A&M won, and gloom pervaded the whole East Tennessee area, you know, for at least until mid-morning because of all that. It's a very pervasive thing. The university, in many, many ways, is an important part of understanding East Tennessee. In conclusion, what unites the state that you can learn from here? I could think of two things. One, economically, I think it's Tennessee's advantages statewide in manufacturing and distribution. Now, there are other things that are important, but whether it's FedEx or Nissan or Eastman, I think the central location, the right-to-work law, and now consistently having one of the 3 or 4 best 4-lane highway systems in the country makes Tennessee extraordinarily attractive for manufacturing and distribution. I've seen that change. When I walked across the state, I remember staying in Milton, outside Murfreesboro, with the Knight family. He was the postmaster there. And we sat up after their children had gone to bed, and the mother said she was sad. And I said, well, why is that? She had 2 really fine twin sons. She said, well, they're such good boys, and they're so smart that they'll never get a job around here, and I'll never see my grandchildren. So she said, I'm sad about that. Well, about a month ago, one of those boys was named vice president of manufacturing for a Nissan Motor Company, and the other one had a 25-year career there. So they did get a job, but that job wasn't there in 1978. The other thing that unifies our state, I think, is music. I mean, Tennesseans love music, all different kinds of it, and so much of it originates here. I've mentioned, you know, from Memphis to Nashville to the upper East Tennessee mountains. In the 80s, I asked the legislature to appropriate some money to match the endowments of symphonies and community orchestras in Tennessee to sort of celebrate the music of the state as a unifying force, and they did. And, for example, if Knoxville got $500,000, why, they'd have to raise $500,000. And I went around and played the piano with 21 of the symphonies and community orchestras to kind of advertise that. Looking back, the thing that surprised me the most about the importance of something statewide was something called Tennessee Homecoming 86, which some of you've never heard of. It was a very simple, boring idea. I mean, I asked in my second inaugural address every community, and there are 3,000 communities, the 3,000 places with names that people call home. I said, I would like to ask you to do 3 things. One is find something to celebrate about Alcoa or Grinder Switch or Milan. Then plan a celebration, celebrate it, and invite everybody who ever lived there to come. When I explained that to the legislature, a couple of them went to sleep in my office during my presentation, but the thing just took off. And there were hundreds of these celebrations, and many of them produced things that lasted today. And I think it was simply because it caused people to think about themselves and not worry about keeping up with the Joneses. You know, Memphis is often worried about Nashville. And I remember Wilma Dykeman, our state historian who lived in Newport over here, she would say, there they are, down there in Nashville, just sitting there waiting for us to come see them. And then Nashville and Carlisle, about every 10 years, Nashville goes through a personality crisis and people start worrying about how can such a sophisticated city be called Music City when there's so much more to it than that. Well, here's my concluding story. When we were recruiting the Saturn General Motors people, the last event was to bring their executives into the governor's residence, and Honey and I thought about what to do. So we served them country ham and a dinner that went along with that, and I invited Charlie McCoy, the harmonica player, to perform after dinner. And he did a beautiful job. And after it was over, one of the Nashville ladies came up to me and said, "Oh, Governor, I'm so embarrassed." I said, "About what?" She said, "That harmonica player." She said, "What will those people from Detroit think of us?" She said, why didn't you offer them Chopin?" And I said, "Madam, why should I offer them average Chopin when we've got the best harmonica player in the world?" So the idea of homecoming was, it doesn't matter what it is, find some strength in yourself or your little community or your big city and celebrate it, and don't try too hard to change it. And all of that, when it's done, adds up to Tennessee. Thank you.